Good morning, everyone. I am Kamala Rampersad de Silva, Chief Executive Officer of the Caribbean Corporate Governance Institute, and it is my absolute pleasure to welcome you to today, day 3 of Governance Week 2026. I'm going to ask Quentrell if he can pull up our opening presenter for today, and that's Mr. Diego Thomas, you see there. So, Diego has extensive experiences within the finance and accounting fields, where from 2012 he practiced as external auditor at the firm BDO. He undertook external financial statement audits in private, public, and listed companies until January 2015, when he transitioned into the public service within the Ministry of Finance and Public Service in the Public Enterprises Division in Jamaica. He has been integral in the collaboration in the division to formulate appropriate responses to instances in which the management and administration of the public body's affairs is discovered to be non-compliant with government's policies, statutes, and subsidiary legislation. These include the development of the division's public bodies debt monitoring tool and the research and development in a draft monitoring and evaluation framework for public bodies. Currently, Diego is the acting principal director in the Public Bodies Governance, Coordination, and Analysis branch. So you could read a little bit more about him in the agenda that we have shared with all of you. At the moment now, Diego, I want to say welcome to Governance Week 2026. We are all anxiously anticipating your contribution this morning. So I hand over the floor to you now.
Uh, Thank you for that lovely presentation, and thank you for having me. Thank you for inviting me and giving myself the opportunity to share with you what Jamaica is doing for public bodies governance, and how is it that we can share with the region. So today I will be looking at how the architecture of governance helps or facilitate the public sector. And I will first look on, provide a list of the primary laws and the that sets out what we have with the defined public bodies, and provide a bit of history as to why they were created. And then I will go into some of the key provisions of these legislations, and also look at the corporate governance framework. And I know you said you're particularly interested in one of our newest pieces of legislation, which I will speak to as well, and provide in-depth understanding and knowledge in, because it is something that is quite new within the region and even globally. And I hope that we'll be able to share our experience with other, counterparts in the region and even across the globe. Now, our public bodies and our public bodies and our institutions that are government owned are governed under different pieces of legislation. We have first and foremost what we call the Financial Administration and Audit Act, which is a piece of legislation which predates the Jamaica's constitution. And it is through this piece of legislation that the governance and the requirements of how government funds, and these are taxpayer monies, are funded. We also then have the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which is the foundational governance legislation for government companies, whether they are companies formed as a limited liability corporation, or these are entities formed through statutes, which we call statutory bodies. Now, this legislation came into being in 2001 and have been amended multiple times since then, because we recognize that governance evolves, and as it evolves and as environment in which these bodies function in, we need to adapt with it as well. And this is supported by regulations. And the latest regulation is the nomination, selection, and appointment to boards regulations, which you spoke of. Now, we also have what you call executive agencies. Now, these are bodies formed without the separation that government companies have from the central government. It is through these bodies that the minister exercises control and takes advice from what we call an advisory board. These fall under the Executive Agencies Act. And then the final sets of body is the Local Governance Act, which speaks to local authorities. Some jurisdictions will call it municipal authorities. So it is through this piece of legislation that the governance framework sets out what exists for these bodies where it is set up through an elected council. But the focus predominantly will be for government companies and the statutory bodies and on a lesser extent, executive agencies, and how the regulations, the laws, and how they function, and how our laws and tries to ensure that what exists for them is comparable to what exists in the private sector. Now, the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act is the overarching legislation responsible for public bodies governance. And what this means is that in Jamaica, we have quite a number of public entities. And when I say public bodies, I'm, in your jurisdiction, you might refer to them as parastatal or as state-owned enterprises. Now, because we have so many of them, which are vast in terms of what they're set up to do, in terms of their mandate, and vast in terms of their legislation or their constituting documents, this Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act seeks to pretty much capture all of what government intends. Because at the end of the day, it is the government which owns or controls these entities. So the government has to put rules and laws, regulations, policies in place in which it can direct to these companies how they should function, how the board should be constituted, how they should go about having their financial statements prepared, how they should manage staffing related matters and paying dividends and so on and so forth. No, this was first introduced in 2001. It was amended in 2003, 2010, 2011, 2014, 2015, and the last time it was amended is 2019. Now, some of these amendments are not, some of them are small changes and some are major changes. And these amendments ensures that when there are new advances in legislations, so for example, when the Public Procurement Act was amended, you would and created the Public Investment Management System, an amendment was done to the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act to ensure or to dictate to public bodies that they should also follow those legislations. So you explicitly stated in the legislation that speaks to public bodies. Now, it promotes an improved corporate governance in public bodies. And what I mean by this is that government companies sometimes are seen as, less effective than the private sector. And what we try to achieve with the PBMA is to ensure that a board member of a public company can walk out of that boardroom for the public body and walk into the private sector, into a banking boardroom, and there's no difference in terms of the quality of persons there. And this is how the legislation tries to achieve that. Now, it provides a structured framework to facilitate consistency and harmony in the rules that govern public bodies. And this may include, for example, some entities are created in statute, and their statute might provide for um, the annual reports to be approved and submitted within 6 months and 9 months or whatever the case may be. So what this overarching legislation says is that all annual reports must be provided, completed and submitted to the portfolio of the responsible minister within 4 months. And then it outlines the responsibilities of the key stakeholders, including the chairman, the CEO, and it provides for the responsibility of the minister, and so on and so forth. Now, in government, we have what we call a reporting cycle. And government companies, they don't operate, on their own whim. The government sets out the policy mandates for these entities, and they are expected to what we term do a budget process where at the start of the financial year, before the financial year starts, they're supposed to have their corporate plan um, approved by Parliament, and this includes financial planning, operational planning. It is presented in Parliament, it is debated, and they get the stamp of approval from both houses of Parliament. And this is published in what we call a public bodies book, budget book. It's about 200 pages of all the self-financing public bodies. Each public body has 5 pages dedicated to them. You have a summary sheet with their major targets for the year. You have a profit and loss budget, balance sheet, cash flow, and detailed income and expenditure statement. And this is we do that for 51 self-financing, commercial public bodies. And during the year, these entities are required to report to the Ministry of Finance and their portfolio ministry on a monthly, quarterly, and half-yearly basis. Now, on a monthly basis, they report on their basic financial performance, and we monitor them in terms of how they're achieving their budgets for that they set out to achieve. And where we identified gaps or their variances, then we do intervention strategies to try to bring them back in line, because it's imperative that public bodies achieve what they set out to achieve, because the whole of government's economic program and developmental program somewhat is underpinned by the performance of these entities. And at the end of the year, they do audited financial statements and prepare annual reports, which is tabled in the Houses of Parliament again. And then you can have a debate on, how did they perform? And these are all provided for in our PBMA. Now, I'm just going to speak quickly in a few key sections. Section 6 of the legislation requires that public bodies have a board of governance. And this is to ensure that you create these companies, you need to have persons who are competent and experienced and dedicated to ensuring that the overall long-term strategies of the entities are being achieved. They're to ensure there's accountability for the resources that is under their management. So it is through these boards that CEOs are appointed and are held to account. And there's a deep reporting requirements between the boards, the CEOs, and the appointing authority. Section 3, and this is very important of the legislation, requires that the financial statements of public bodies be prepared in accordance with international financial reporting standards. And this is very important, where you can take up the financial statements of a government entity, and it is comparable to an entity operating in the private sphere. Financial statements are done within the same financial reporting framework. And then it also provides for annual reports to be submitted to the portfolio minister within 4 months. And it sets out within the legislation what should be included in that annual reporting. Now, Section 5 is very important, because back in the days, historically, public bodies were able to borrow freely and without proper checks and balances, this borrowing can then pose what we call a fiscal risk to the government, where you may go out and take on debt that you didn't, properly structure, and then where you fall into difficulties servicing that debt, then it becomes a call on the government to step in. And we have seen in the past where, it has happened into government companies. Um, Probably you could look back at our former airlines, you'd have borrowed extensively. And when you can't service that, the government is then called on to help you. So what Section 5 provides for is that before a government company is able to borrow, the Minister of Finance has to give approval. And this is after an assessment is done and the risks are, looked at before you can go ahead and engage in banks or the private sector to provide debt, because you don't want to have unplanned calls coming on the budget when governments have schools to build and hospitals to provide supplies for. Now, the PBMA provides or requires that each government company has an audit committee. And this is critically important. This is the only committee actually mandated by the legislation. And this is to ensure that audit forms a critical part of the assessment and oversight of these entities. The audit committee rightfully is a subcommittee of the board, and it should be chaired by a board member. Now, the legislation also says that if the committee doesn't have the full competence, you can co-opt someone from the outside of the public body's board to become a member of that committee. So, for example, you can co-opt someone who's a registered or a public accountant to sit on that committee, who would be able to guide and help the committee deliberate on audit matters. And the Section 25 of the legislation, and this is where penalties for non-compliance is contained. So there are some sections where if there are breaches, then the legislation allows for financial penalties to be imposed on those who would have been responsible for those breaches. For example, if the annual reports are not submitted on time, you can face a breach. If you go ahead and borrow without the minister's approval, you can face a financial penalty as well. And then Section 28 speaks to the supremacy of this legislation, which means that where there are conflicts related to other public body legislations, then this legislation reigns supreme. Now, the corporate governance framework is pretty much a policy document that was implemented in and around 2011 and was revised in 2012 to kind of to pretty much strengthen the governance provisions that were instituted for public bodies. And it is through this policy document that we now had pretty much the creation of other policy documents and legislations, including the nomination selection regulations. Now, the corporate governance framework was, built on the principles of OECD. It was built on the principles of corporate governance from New Zealand, from the UK. And it was, tailored for the Jamaican experience, because we didn't want to take something from another jurisdiction and just impose it on ourselves. So we looked at what existed globally and we brought it here. We did extensive internal consultations, and then we implemented it in around 2011-12. Now, the context of this is that there are approximately 157 public bodies operating in Jamaica. Now, with such a large number of entities, you need to assure yourself that they all function similarly. Now, the legislation, goes far, but you need a bit more. You need to have a bit more specificity. And this is where this corporate governance framework came into being. And it is there to ensure that accountability is held to various statutory bodies. Now, because the government operates, public bodies within the government operates in such a dynamic and financially charged environment, they are challenged to be fully compliant with development and regulatory requirements. There is this thought that boards can within themselves learn and evolve and adapt, but because they are so dynamic, because of how they function is, to achieve a particular mandate, and they have the political pressures and they have the community pressures to achieve tasks. We don't see it as ideal to leave the boards to adopt on their own or to adopt corporate governance principles on their own. So we set these, policy guidelines to say, instead of waiting for you to go and do your research and bring in your own principles, here are, some tools that you can use. And if you follow these, then it will help guide you. And here at the ministry, we do extensive research in looking at what works best for everyone. And we provide it to the public bodies, and then we judge them on it. And I'll talk about that judging a bit later. No, it helps with monitoring and oversight. The framework provides for the establishment of effective monitoring arrangement, which includes monitoring from the ministry's perspective, which includes monitoring from the portfolio ministry, and includes monitoring from the public body. And the framework, as I said, is designed to embody best practices. So it is the best of what existed at the time. We're currently, though, in the process of finalizing a review and going to consultations very shortly, because we recognize that since 2012 and now, things have changed a bit. There have been shifts in other directions, and we need to move with times, because we can't allow the entities to fall behind, because when they succeed for all of us. The objectives of the CGF, just three key objectives pulled out: to strengthen the mechanisms for accountability of the board, chairperson, CEO, CorpSec, and other key personnel, to ensure that the public interest is advanced by adherence to proper standards, codes of conduct, and to strengthen the governance accountability systems of public bodies in order to facilitate greater probity, transparency, efficiency, and functions of the government. Now, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about just a few of the principles. There are 20. I'm not going to go through all 20, but just going to pick out a few key ones. Principle 1, very important. Every public body is headed by a governance board with a chairperson at the helm. So if you create an organization, a company, or a statutory body, it must have a board in place to lead its strategic direction. The board is accountable to the portfolio minister. So remember how government is set up. You have the executive, you have the legislature, and you have the judiciary. Now, within the executive, they have tasks to achieve. And to achieve those tasks, they may determine that you want to create a company or a statutory body to undertake that task. So, for example, using an example here, one task might be to provide water supply to the public. And if they want to do that through a government company, you're going to create a statutory body or register a company to build out the water infrastructure. Now, how does the executive ensures that the tasks that are established are being achieved? It is through a board that they put in place. So you appoint board members to ensure that the policy objectives of the executive are being achieved. And that is why Principle 1 says every public body must have a board with a chairperson at the helm. Now, Principle 2 covers what are the responsibilities and rules for the board. And it sets out that they are the primary decision-making authority, they retain full control, and it ensures that the strategic objectives of the entity aligns with that of the government. Because you don't want to have government companies going on a frolic of their own, where they are going doing activities that doesn't align to their mandate, or even creeping into activities that are of the mandate of another entity. So the boards are the ones that are there to, you know, keep that in check, because management may, based on performance objectives, or how they are established, may see that if they do more, they do different things, they could probably make more income, and have more surpluses. And so the boards are there just to say to government companies, it's not just about making a surplus or a profit, but to ensure that you are providing the services that you are set up to provide to the public. Principle 3 speaks to the role of the chairperson, that they should be independent, with no executive or material connections of the public body. So essentially what we're saying here is that the CEO and the chairperson should be two separate persons. CEO is reporting to the chair, and the chair is responsible for the board. And the chairperson is supposed to oversee and undertake the annual performance evaluation of the board, and then report to the portfolio minister. Now, Principle 8 is where I'm going to spend a bit of time, because this is where the nomination, selection, appointment regulation comes in. Now, between 2021 and 2023, we would have done extensive consultations and discussions and deliberation to bring into effect our nomination, selection, appointment regulations. So what the regulation provides for is that every public body board, and it's 157 I stated, every single one of them would have gone through a process of developing what we call a board composition or a board competency template. So you would list and outline all the technical competencies that are required for that public body board to function effectively. So if it needs an accountant, if it needs an attorney, if you need an engineer or a medical doctor, you state those. Now, the regulation then says that board members who are to be appointed to these boards must have these competencies. So how it works in practicality is that the Ministry of Finance maintain what we call a database of prospective directors. Now, every individual who wants to serve on the board of a public body must, based on the regulation, apply to be in that database. And once they apply, then a due diligence process is undertaken here to determine that what they submit matches with their historical performances and their competencies and their resume, essentially. And once that due diligence exercise is completed, then they are added to the database. They are added as a record. The person's name, address, other personal information, and then the competencies that are deemed based on what they have been doing in their past, experiences, education, qualification, then competencies are assigned to them based on what they would have selected. Now, when the appointing authority requires a board to be appointed, they will then write to the ministry and say, provide a list of persons who are competent to be on that board. And what the database does is that it queries the entire composition. I think we have about 2,000 persons in the database now. It queries that based on what the composition, the competency document of the public body is, and it provides a list of all the persons that matches the competencies of that public body. Then the appointing authority gets that list and then select the persons that are best suited to be on that board. No, it doesn't end there because there is also supposed to be a process of monitoring and evaluation, and this is done by the chairperson and the corporate secretary. Now, once a board is appointed, they ought to review the board composition. So if the board requires you to have 10 competencies, then the composition of persons appointed to the board should match back or should achieve those 10 competencies. And where that is not achieved, then it is the responsibility of the chairman or chairperson working with the corporate secretary and the permanent secretary to notify the appointing authority that you have a board that is what we deem to be incompetent because they don't achieve all the required competence that they would have set out in the established in the first place. Now, the regulation also provides for persons who are required to be on the board. So these are what we call the ex officios. Now, if it is that you are in the legislation of if in the constituting document that sets up the public body, if you are so named based on the position that you hold, that you must sit on the board, then you don't need to be within the database and you would not go through the process of being selected, but you're appointed done the same based on how the regulation sets out the appointment. Because what we agree is that if you are named in the legislation or constituting documents to be on the board, then you would have already been competent from the mere fact that you are sitting in that seat where you are at. The other thing is that what the regulations provide for is that upon a change of minister or announcement of election, all board members should tender their resignation. And what this does, it gives a new minister the ability to start with a reset the board essentially. But this resignation does not take effect immediately. What the regulation says is that once you submit that resignation, it does not take effect until a new minister comes in or the same minister comes in and appoint a new board in the case of a general election or in the case of just a change of minister or portfolio change, the minister can ask that the board continue until their end of their initial term. And what we recommend is that the appointing authority should act within a period of 60 days to ensure that there is some amount of certainty and consistency and continuity. However, a minister is not, based on the current regulation, a minister does not have the ability to change the entire composition of the membership of the board. The regulation restricts the appointing authority to retain at least a third of the existing or outgoing board for continuity. So that, you can have knowledge passing on and you can have experiences passing on. So you don't leave the public bodies with a board in what you call a flat-footedness nature. And the interesting thing about the regulation is that it encourages or it requires diversity and equity. So each public body board must have a minimum of a third or 30% of any one gender. So you should not, the regulation restricts you from having a board of only men or having a board of only women. You must have at least a third of one gender there to ensure you have balance, so you have competing ideas. Now, the framework, though it is not in the regulation, the framework also encourages that you have diversity in age and experience and competencies. Because what we recognize, though it is not legislated, we do recognize that having a mixture of youth and different knowledge and different competencies, it helps to support, robust discussions and robust debate, and it leads to better results at the board level. And that is why the regulations are so written. So this is what I was speaking about earlier. Board selection. So Principle 9 of the CGF would speak about board diversity and equity. Principle 10 speaks about board selection and appointment. There are some boards that are of significant importance. So like those involved in the financial and gaming sector. Now, those boards, before someone can be appointed as a director to those boards, they have to do what they have to go through a process of fit and proper assessment. Now, this is more an in-depth assessment of someone's financial history, their character, whether they have any, criminal records or they have been bankrupt, or is a deep dive into these sets of persons. Because what we want to assure ourselves that the persons who are going to be responsible for policy around finance and gaming and those large sectors, that it is those that have a clean history that is there. And these are all provided for in the regulations. Oh, but before I close, let me go back here. Let me stay right there. Before I close, I would want to say that what we have found is that Jamaica leads in this regard. There is not any, if not just a few countries that have established laws around something of this nature. So most governments still allow, have a bit of freedom, so to speak, in how board members are selected. And what we have found is that in establishing how these boards are appointed or how members are selected, then we get more competent persons appointed to the boards. We get more persons who are technically advanced, who can contribute more. And we get, stronger policies coming out from these boards, and we get better performance at the end of the day. And one of the things we do to recognize those performance is that we have a annual corporate governance awards. So every year we invite public bodies who would have performed exceptionally well to apply, to nominate themselves, or they may be nominated by others, and an independent panel is established to review the performance of the public bodies, and then we have a grand gala to reward them, reward the best chairperson, reward the boards that have the best um, audit and the best annual report, who are following the risk management to the T, and we recognize them for their work. And this is not done on a financial performance basis, because what we try to do is to have a level playing field, because not all government companies are set up to make a profit. So the finances would be would disadvantage those who are there to provide a service. So we look only on their governance aspect. Do your annual report done on time? Is the board properly constituted? Are they doing their performance evaluation? Do they regularly meet? Are there issues? How is it resolved? How does our conflicts of interest resolved? What policies do the boards have in place to deal with matters of that, and how does it function? And what we have find is that the public bodies, they appreciate being rewarded. They appreciate being recognized for their contribution in this regard. And it's something that we will continue to do because we see it as something critical. Um, I think probably here we could take a few questions to highlight any areas I may have missed, if there is any.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. So Diego, what you could probably do is just take down the slides for a bit so we can engage with you. And just before we take the first question, because we do have some questions in the chat, I wanted to ask you, we normally have a cutoff time at 12:30, but you have presented so much to us, and there will be a lot of questions. I wanted to ask you if you have time, if we could go over. Is it
Sure.
possible at all? Yeah, our
Yes.
next our first panel will begin at 12 noon your time, which is 1 p.m. here in Trinidad and Tobago. Would you have that extra time to give us?
Again,
Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much. Because I will tell you, Diego, what you have presented here for us is so far-reaching. If we can replicate this in many of the other Caribbean countries, we would see significant improvement in the quality of governance in our state sector. So I want to commend you on the work that you have been doing, commend everyone in Jamaica. And I want us to take note that when Diego presented, when the PBMA first came into being, it was all the way in 2001. So this is not overnight success. This is the people of Jamaica recognizing the need to ensure they do things differently. They set these systems in place, and they are not a 9-day wonder. They have been working this for decades. So I have a lot of questions as well, but I'm going to give preference to the chat. I saw that we did have uh, 2 questions already. The first, oh, and just let me say, for everybody else who has been saying as well that this has been a really great presentation, we do have the survey link in the chat. I'm asking everyone today, please click on that survey link and give us your feedback. Okay, no exceptions today. All right, so let's go to the questions. And the first one, I think, was from Don. I had seen that first, but okay, I'm not seeing Don's question right now. Let me go to Joanna Seaton. Joanna asks, how many ex officio members are allowed on a state board in Jamaica? If there's no set number, how is it determined? Do you have ex officio board members?
yes. So there is no set number. It varies from entity to entity. So some public bodies, their legislation would state that you're required to have 5. Some would say you have required to have 7. So it varies, and it is listed in those constituting documents. And it is particularly for those entities that are involved in regulatory matters, are involved in legal, like those that have uh, those involved in tax matters, those involved in, as I said, regulations and legislative matters, generally have a large number of ex officios. But for those that are commercial in nature, they tend to have a more free-ranging board.
Okay, so but at any rate, there will not be any one board that is dominated by ex officios. And if it is, do the same rules apply in terms of when their reporting is done, the monthly reporting, the publishing of the annual report, the financial statements and all that? Are they held to the same standards?
Yeah. So what the corporate governance framework provides for, is that ex officios on boards aren't treated any differently or seen any differently from other board members. Notwithstanding where they being identified as ex officio, they are still appointed by the appointing authority. And their term of office still mirrors that of the rest of the board. They participate on the same, they vote, they make decisions on the same. It is just that we see them as there because of the position they hold otherwise. So the number of ex officios would not impact the performance of the board because, for example, there are boards that would say for the hospital, the regional hospital boards, they may require that the regional health director be a member of the board, or the regional CEO of the regional hospital be a member of the board, or so on. And they being there would not change the outcome or the performance of the entity because those persons are already, a part of the service. They are part of the government. It's not, you don't find public body boards having ex officios of persons from the private sector. You may have one or two, but it would not be of any large number.
Right. Okay, good. And I'm glad to know that the governance framework applies equally to everyone because what you're looking at is your outcomes and the performance. Okay, so I there's a comment from Nicole Thomas. She says, "This is mind-blowing. Absolute trailblazers. Hats off to the government of Jamaica and its people." Nicole, I want to share at our very first governance week that we had in 2020, we had a presentation from Greta Bouge, who was at the time the chair of the governance committee at the private sector organization of Jamaica. Greta has been one of those people who were trailblazers in this respect. And it was really such a phenomenal thing. Every year for Governance Week, we feature some aspect of this Public Management Accountability Act from Jamaica because it's such an amazing piece of legislation in terms of the work that they're doing. So we are happy, Diego, to have you here to share it. It has to be a constant sharing because, of course, it takes time to really spread good news. Really, really, Diego. It takes so much more work to spread good news. Bad news will just fly across the region, you know. But really, I agree entirely with Nicole. This is absolutely mind blowing. It's really trailblazing work that's done in the region. Kevin, I saw your hand, but I've just found Don's questions. I'm going to ask Don's question first because it's an easy one, and then we'll come to you. His question, Diego, was, are there limits to how many boards a director could serve on? This is called overboarding, I think, right?
Yeah.
So,
So the regulations restricts a director to serve on three boards simultaneously. However, there's an allowance for boards of subsidiaries. So if a government public body company has subsidiaries, the directors can serve on those subsidiary boards without impacting that limit of three.
okay. Okay, great. Thank you. So, Kevin, you can unmute now, make your comment or your question as brief as possible so we can engage with many of the other participants in the room, okay?
Okay, hi, good day, everyone. First of all, that was a excellent presentation there. It brought a lot of clarity and closure to what, I had a lot more things to ask, but seeing that you already answered during the presentation, I just had two things to add here. The first thing is, with respect to someone mentioned about the board, more members of the board there, I just wanted to know, do you have a specific law or rule or regulation there to appoint more members to a board, or can it just be done arbitrarily, as they say? And also, with respect to the boards, do you all agree that, look, to be appointed to a board, especially in the public sector, that you should have some sort of knowledge or some sort of criteria or qualification to be serving on the board? Because right here in Trinidad, you see they're just picking up anybody, Vike, and putting all about the place and expect things to run better. So I just wanted to throw that out to you, and that's my 2 cents there. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank
So
you.
what we have here is regulations and the nomination, selection, and appointment to board regulation. It falls under the Public Bodies Management and Accountability Act, which is pretty much law. Um, it it dictates to the appointing authority who can be appointed to board and how they are appointed to boards. And I mean, I can how it functions. And I'm not talking about a hypothetical here. How it functions in reality is if a minister for some reason takes a list to cabinet to appoint a board that is not originated from the Ministry of Finance, it will be rejected because that would be a breach of the law. So, and it has happened, rejections of that. When a list is provided and a name is not seen on the list, the rejections have happened. Maybe because of an oversight or an error, but there are checks and balances that exist, which ensures that only those who are coming from the database are appointed to boards. And how the database function, as I said before, is that only the persons who match or aligns to the competencies of the public body or the government company can be a part of the pool that is being recommended for appointment. So if it requires engineers and accountants and lawyers, then you wouldn't get a farmer being appointed to that board. But if the board requires a farmer, then you will be on the list for farmers. And that is how it functions. Persons must have experience, they must have competencies. And I mean, everyone can be appointed to a board, because based on the diverseness of all our boards, everyone should be able to meet some of one criteria, but it is which board you fall on. So, for example, for the petroleum refinery, we wouldn't need someone who is a part of the clergy to be a board member, so to speak. But there are other government boards that they can fall on. And that is what we're trying to do, is to ensure that those who are being appointed, their experiences, education, and competencies align to what and remember, we're not the ones who write these competencies down. The competencies are coming from those who are appointing the members to the board. It goes through them, through their permanent secretaries, don't. And so it is a match. We're just ensuring that what they have, that what they would have established as the required competencies is what they are getting. So it is us helping them to ensure and guiding them to ensure that the persons they are appointing are within what they have asked for.
Right. Thanks so much for that, Diego. Derek, I see you have a lovely comment in the chat followed by a question. So do you want to unmute and present your comment and question to Diego directly?
Sure, appreciate it. Morning again. Afternoon, everyone. So a fantastic presentation. Having had the benefit of living and working in Jamaica for 10 years across a span of actually 20 years. I just wanted to point out that it's clear from Diego's presentation that this was instrumental in what we're seeing from Jamaica today, not just the socioeconomic development reduction in crime, but even despite the impact of these shocks, like whether it be economic shocks or that recent hurricane, there's resilience that has been developed. But my simple question is that given that the Bureau of Standards Jamaica, and I have a little bit of a QI background, quality infrastructure, I believe it has formally adopted ISO 37000 and 37001 standards. I was curious as to whether this framework references in any way these standards. Thank you.
No, so not off the top of my head, that the framework doesn't refer to any quality assurance standards directly. What it does provide for is it refers to other legislations, and it provides for there to be confidentiality, that data is protected. And because we function in the data protection, we have a data protection act. So the information for directors would fall on the Data Protection Act. And with regards to anti-bribery management systems, that would fall on the Proceeds of Crime Act. So the regulations would align to what exists in other legislations. And I think this is where the requirement for fit and proper assessments to be done is instituted within the regulations for particular boards, so that you can continue to maintain these elevated systems of accountability for data protection and under the FATF regime that you currently operate under. So for boards, for public body boards, for example, involved in the regulation of the banking sector, those board members have to undergo a fit and proper assessment. That is done outside of the Ministry of Finance. Now, we're not involved. We refer persons for the assessment, and the report is sent back to say what the results are.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Now we have a question from Christina in the chat. Christina, do you want to unmute and ask your question directly as well? Just giving her a second to see if she has time to do it. If not,
Oh, good morning.
Right.
Sorry, yes.
Go
I
ahead,
was
Christina.
busy typing.
Yeah, you have more questions. Yes,
I have
you
more
can ask them
questions.
now.
Yes, sorry. Okay, Diego, please bear with me. Good morning, everyone. I'm firstly attached to First Citizens, and we have a sort of a unique situation here in Trinidad and Tobago in that we are a publicly listed entity, but whose shares are majority owned by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. So that's just to give a context so that Diego has some appreciation. We do hold a group of financial subsidiaries under our company, and of course, the nominations for directorships are mainly done through the majority shareholder, that being the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago. We also try to do some level of assessment of particular skills that are required through skills matrices that we publish through our annual reports. I guess my questions were really, firstly, how did this legislation get passed in the context of, did it require both government and opposition support? What really was, because firstly, before we could even entertain this as something that could work in the other Caribbean territories, we first have to understand how it got passed. How were you guys so fortunate to have the agreement of both the, I suppose, the sitting government at the time and the opposition? That was my first curiosity, I suppose. And then after that, it was more along the lines of having had the assessments done. And let's say if it's the central bank that's conducting the assessment in the case of fit and proper, because we have lots of fit and proper criteria here, and that information then gets fed into the Ministry of Finance, through which the person then enters the database. Does political alignment matter at that point in time? I guess was my second question. And well, I'll stop there for now. Let me give you the opportunity for those two to
Yeah.
answer those two.
So it wasn't a quick process. If you look on the history of it, the PBMA came around 2001, and that would have led to the foundation in the PBMA that allows the minister to make regulations. Now, the corporate governance framework came 2011, 2012. Now, it is in the corporate governance framework where you would have first seen this policy direction being adopted. There are 3 principles in the CJF which speaks explicitly as to the appointment, selection processes, board composition, diversity, and so on. So it is from 2011-12 that the first, sets of ideas around this would have started to be included in official documents. Now, the work inside the ministry would have predated that. The research would have predated that. It would have gone to ministers before and been rejected multiple times. And then around 2018, I think the official policy nomination, selection, appointment policy document was approved. So it took time to get to the regulations going to Parliament. I think, yeah, and it would have been something that both sides would have discussed and supported. Now, generally, things like this don't come from government; they normally come from opposition. But we would have been fortunate to have the government lead this and have this brought to Parliament. I think this was before COVID, it came the first time, and it wasn't approved at that time. It was sent back for further consultations and work. And, it came back in around 2021. And even after being approved in Parliament, it didn't come into effect until about 18 months or thereabout afterwards, because the government would have deemed that there needed to be, I think extensive public consultations and time, and so it wasn't quick.
Yes.
It
Yes,
took
pretty
a
much
while.
similar to the procurement legislation in Trinidad and Tobago.
Yeah.
That took so much time, to get to Parliament, to eventually be passed, and then years before it became proclaimed. And there's still regulations that need to be done around that as well.
Yeah.
So we appreciate that journey.
And the political side of it, one of the things I probably would have left out is that the regulation explicitly states that if you are a member of the House of Representatives or the Senate or a councillor, if you're an elected representative, you cannot be in the database. It's explicitly stated. You cannot be on the board, right? And this was something passed into law. It took a simple majority, but it passed into law, passed in both houses of parliament. So the government would have said no politicians should be on the boards of government companies. Doesn't restrict those who are politically aligned, though, as long as they are competent.
Yes.
Understood.
Okay. Thank you so much, Christina. We have a question from Joanna Seaton next. Joanna, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Hi, sure. Good morning, everyone. So essentially, I've actually come across this question from someone recently, and I've given thought about it, and I would like to know, from Mr. Diego, having such vast experience within the governance industry, what are your thoughts on including a staff representative, specifically for handling staff welfare issues on a board? Is this a norm within governance? Should it be encouraged?
You're referring to the staff of the government
Organization.
company?
Correct. Correct.
No, so staff, we don't see any need for staff to be on the board. Probably outside of the CEO in some
That's right.
instances, but
Because the CEO is a staff member. So
yes, but
usually the
in some
CEO
instances the CEO may be on the board, not in all. And this would be explicitly stated in the constituting document. So if it is not stated there, then they would not be on the board.
Right, but more
But
often than not, they would be invited to
so
speak to the meeting.
so staff members are what we call board invitees. So they will be invited to make a presentation, to give information, either at the board level or at the board committee level. But you're not members of either the committee or the board, outside of where it is explicitly stated. You do have one or two legislation which would refer to the CEO and probably a deputy being a member of the board, but those would have already been cases that would have been deliberated and approved by Parliament.
And also just to share a little bit for Joanna's benefit, most boards would have subcommittees of their boards, and there more than likely maybe an HR committee, which will then look at staff issues. So that is the way the governance structure would work on the whole to ensure that issues involving staff
Agreed.
are also dealt with. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mohini, yes, I see Mohini's hand up. You're welcome. So we'll go to Mohini, and then there's another question from Christina. We'll come back to her. Go ahead, Mohini.
All right. Very quickly, and this is in regards to Johanna's question. And I think Johanna, we're Guyanese, right? So I think I understand her question, and that is some boards at some time in Guyana, there was this thing about including a staff representative, as in a workers' participation representative. Most entities have what you would call a workers' participation council or committee. And the person that heads that committee is invited as an ex officio member, Diego, on the board. And I think that is where Johanna's question, what is what has not been happening of recent? That was a trend in Guyana many, many, many moons ago. But what has not been happening of recent is that trend continuing without an explanation, if you understand, as to why it stopped. And I think maybe, I'm not sure if Joanna wanted to put in the comments if that is where her line of thinking is coming from. But that's what we had in Guyana way back when, but not happening now.
And
So
if we may ask you, Mohini, because you are part of a board in Guyana, do you guys practice that? Is that
No,
so?
no, well, no, we don't, and that is what I'm
No.
saying. It is
Yeah.
not being practiced now in state agencies in Guyana, but it was something, if my recollection, but it was many years ago. So
Okay.
I'm not sure if that is where, Johanna probably would
Thank you,
have
but okay.
recognized that it used to, and what is happening, why is it not, and if Jamaica has a system of it. But I think we heard her Diego's explanation.
yeah, but outside of probably school boards, it doesn't we don't have it functioning like that. We do, however, for some public bodies that are involved in matters that may impact staff on a broader scale. So, for example, we have an entity known as the National Housing Trust, which takes a percentage of employees' salary and puts it in a pool of funds to build houses. Now, for that board, it has union representatives on it as ex officio members. So the union representative for the workers' union, the broad workers' union. So it is not for the employees of the entity, but to represent on a broader scale. That's how we have it, have those considerations happening. Not
Okay.
for the individual employees of the entity. What we'll have is the HR committee, you would have the HR manager being invited to the committee to provide information, not a member of the committee, but as an invitee to have discussions with the board who would establish the HR policies and so on. But staff members can be board members of other public bodies, though.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Now there's a question from Christina. You mentioned that there's an independent body that does the monitoring and evaluation that assesses the organization. She was asking if this is your central bank that does it. The
No,
board
the
conducting the
monitoring and evaluation would be done by the Ministry of Finance and the Public Service. We have recently established what we call the Independent Fiscal Commission that does a broader monitoring of the fiscal performance of the whole of government, including public bodies, but not on the governance. Oh, I think she's probably referring to the awards panel. So the independent awards panel is done, or the fit
Okay,
and
though. Yeah, the
or the
fit
fit
and
and
proper.
proper. Okay.
Yes.
So the fit and proper is done by the Financial Investigations Division, which is a separate department of government which has financial investigators and persons who are, I think, within the securities. So they have the ability to charge people, to prosecute crimes, financial crimes, and investigate financial crimes. Yeah, so they're the ones who does the fit. We at the ministry has actually an MOU with them, on how we coordinate the transmission of sensitive information between for prospective directors.
Okay, great. So there's a question from Charlene in the chat. I'm going to go to it next. But before I do, I wanted to say to Colin, who has been with us. Yes, and Colin is still here with us. I know he's been championing a lot of Jamaica's success over the last 2 days. So just to encourage him if he wanted to unmute, share any thought, comment, or question. And go ahead, Colin. I see you've unmuted.
No, just to reinforce some of the things. I mean, in my past life, I spent time in Jamaica, and I was exposed to a minister of finance who's now with the IMF, and a lot of the IDB programs that went through Jamaica in order to build strength and in a number of different areas, right? So I was able to understand, I suppose, how Jamaica, to some extent, Diego and you will obviously have a much better idea than me, the structure, the discipline, and the approach that they took to take Jamaica forward. And what I've said in the past 2 days is Jamaica is a sterling example as a Caribbean country that has basically been able to significantly restructure its economy, to strengthen it, And the comment that I made is that following Hurricane Melissa, it was significant to read about the upgrade from Moody's, right? Which took place. If I remember, the hurricane hit in October, and the Moody's upgrade came in February of the following year, right? And that was really because the government, and this is not being political, had instituted a multi-layered financing approach to deal with something like this. And I believe I could have the number wrong, but you all were able to raise in excess of, or to get funding arranged for $6.7 billion or something of that order, US dollars, right? Which basically, was put in place. And that's just one simple example. And when I talk about, the governance, the framework, the things that you talked about covered legislation, talked about the code, talked about reporting, talked about accountability, and talked about sanctions and penalties, right? So it's performance oriented. It kind of mirrors the private sector and mirrors the best of the private sector. It doesn't mirror all the private sector because some private sector companies are not doing this, right? So
Yes.
that's my overarching comment. I think
Thanks,
that Jamaica has come a long way and has done great work over the last several years.
I appreciate that input, and also what you have said, Colin, actually now goes directly into the question from Charlene. Right, Charlene, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Thank
Are
you.
you able to? Yes, go ahead.
Thank you so very much. So I was asking Diego to speak a little to the role that the private sector played. Somebody had asked about the tensions rather between the political parties in getting this passed. Because I was asking Diego to speak a little about the role that the PSOJ played in all of this.
At the time there wasn't much tension though, but they would have been involved in the consultations, with the discussions with even at the Joint Select Committee at Parliament. So the PSOJ would have contributed significantly. And the
I would
PSOJ
say probably led the charge, Diego, that it was the private sector that really pushed government to move
and
in this
they,
direction.
yeah, and we partner with them for a number of matters related to governance. I was up to last night. I was in discussion with members of the PSOJ regarding our governance awards and so on. So they continue to support us and to provide guidance. And I mean, some of the mediation you might refer to would have happened probably in the background, not have been in the foreground. But
Yes,
yeah.
quiet lobbying. Yes. So we just have a few more minutes remaining of this time. I wanted to be able to ask Dr. Farrell, if he's still here with us, if he had any comment or question he wanted to present as well, because Dr. Farrell is someone who we look to for a lot of guidance here in Trinidad and Tobago, and very experienced in this area of public sector governance. Dr. Farrell?
Well, all I would say is that comment to commendations to Diego and to Jamaica, and to point out that we here in Trinidad should have been ahead of Jamaica in that regard. Unfortunately, the recommendations which had been made precisely along the lines of what Jamaica has done. So this is the State Enterprise Review Committee of 2016, which I chaired. And we had the example of the Jamaica's PBMA. We had many other examples of models from New Zealand, from Norway, that we looked at and made recommendations to the government of Trinidad and Tobago, essentially along the lines of what Jamaica has successfully implemented. But unfortunately, we are in Trinidad where we are.
Right, but there's so much that we can learn, and particularly, Diego, I love that idea of the public bodies awards and the fact that the organizations are motivated because they feel the appreciation and recognition from the awards that are given at the end of every year.
And we're happy to share more about that. And we have invited you in the past to attend.
Yes. Yes. And I look forward to this year. I'm hoping that all will be well and that there will be a function this year.
Yep.
Yes. All right. Well, Diego, I want to thank you so much. There are many things that you highlighted today that I am heartened to know has remained, because I was concerned when I had heard that there were so many revisions over the years. So particularly the fact that you have retained that diversity on the board, where there must be at least 30% of one or the other gender, and the encouragement of diversity in terms, though it may not be as strong as saying there must be a balance of the genders, but that you encourage age and the diversity in competence and that kind of thing. More so, what I find fascinating is that you have been able to hold on to the fact that even when there is a change in ministers or a change in government, and there's going to be a change in boards, there must be at least a few persons who are retained for institutional knowledge and continuity. Because that was one I thought you guys had lost. Because it generally means, especially if there's a change in government, and persons are looking to say, within your database of persons, there will be those who have political affiliations, and so they may still look for their party supporters among the competency profiles that come to them. But the fact is, if there is a change of government in terms of parties, and you have to retain 1/3 of the board, then it allows for the continuity of projects. It allows for Jamaica to continue to benefit, rather than what we see happen in Trinidad and Tobago several times over. Millions of dollars spent on a project, then it stops. It holds, nothing happens, shell is in place, and the country just does not benefit from all the amount of money that would have been spent. So whether it is, I see Derek is saying, a good example of political maturity, whether it was the law that enforces that to ensure that behavior is reinforced, but it's a wonderful example. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to come today and share with us. We will be inviting you again. We'll be inviting other members from Ministry of Finance as well, because this story needs to be told over and over and over again, so that we have everyone across the region who are able to speak to it, who are able to explain it, who are able to argue and lobby for it in their own countries as well, so that we can all see that improvement of governance of our state sectors in the region. So thank you very, very much.